Hello, everyone, and welcome to another presentation of the Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy. This is our monthly entry, which is a spinoff of a very popular podcast out of Kansas State University. That's called Smoke and Mirrors, Ag Policy Unfiltered. Well, today we bring you another edition of Clearing the Air on Agricultural Policy. And what we're hoping to do today is hone in on a very topical matter in agricultural circles right now. And it's a subject of choice that we want to spend some time on biofuels within the agricultural economy and what's happening there within the framework of biofuels activity and policy. And certainly energy itself is at the forefront of late given world events. So this is a very opportune moment to get into what's happening with biofuels. We've brought in a guest panelist who is very well versed in this area, and you'll hear from him in just a moment. Allow me, though, to introduce the rest of the panelists, several of which you'll be hearing from as we go on today. Jenny Ifft is the Associate Professor and Extension Specialist and the Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at Kansas State University. She's also the host of the aforementioned weekly podcast, Smoke and Mirrors. Joining us just a bit later, Brad Lubben, Associate Extension Professor and Agricultural and Public Policy Specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And Mark Edelman, Professor Emeritus and longtime Agriculture and Rural Policy Specialist out of Iowa State University. We'll bring Brad and Mark in just a bit later. But first, we'd like to tell you about our special guest today. He is Dr. Scott Irwin. Scott is the Lawrence J. Norton Chair of Agricultural Marketing out of the University of Illinois. He's a globally recognized leader in agricultural economics. He has published many commodity books many times over. His influential research on commodity markets is sought after by academics, by farmers, by policymakers. He's also a frequent media commentator on these topics for outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Scott is best known for his work on commodity market speculation and biofuel policy. He has had multiple invitations to testify before the U.S. Congress on those topics. He's received numerous awards and accolades within agricultural economic circles. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Jenny Ifft, and she will get us going with our conversation with Scott Irwin. So, Jenny, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. Looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to just start off with, you've spent decades researching commodity markets and biofuels, but I think when you started, biofuels have been around a long, long time, but they weren't where they were today. So I'm curious what that was like as you saw it happening. Was any of it surprising? If, you would go back in a time machine to when you started, could have you imagined where we are today?
No, not really. Basically, for the first 3/4 of my professional career, fuels was definitely a very niche topic. Actually, very few ag economists paid a lot of attention to. But that really changed starting in roughly 2004 to 2006. In the fall of 2006, the price of corn especially started to spike up above the historical price range that we experienced going all the way back to the mid-70s. And as I like to say, the thread that runs throughout my career is a very simple one. I'm obsessed with anything that affects the price of corn and soybeans. And at that time, I realized I was kind of behind the curve in understanding the impact of the ethanol boom that was really getting rolling on the price of corn. And so if I needed to understand what was driving the price of corn, I had to start understanding biofuels better. And I honestly had no idea that here we are 17, 18 years later in the latter third of my career, I spend probably 80% of my time on biofuels. And I never imagined that happening. But that's really a reflection of the rising profile of biofuels markets and policy to the financial health and well-being of the U.S. ag sector. Those are the topics that I'm always going to be interested in. And then on top of it, there's kind of a Byzantine level of complexity of our layers of biofuel policy that are endlessly fascinating to me and literally on a daily, weekly basis are evolving. And that makes something really interesting for an ag economist like myself to uh, constantly try to keep up. So that's kind of
Yeah.
the way I fell into it, really.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And if I think back to when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Illinois, well over 2 decades ago now, it was really trade was what we looked to with hope and enthusiasm in terms of farm income, and I think that went on for a long while, and now I wouldn't say we're having protectionism is having a moment, but we're less enthusiastic about trade, or there's more talk about how do we grow demand domestically, and that's now E15, will that ever become permanent? And now Z, sustainable aviation fuels. And then there's maritime. I've started hearing about maritime fuels. Still haven't wrapped my head around that one. But I'm curious, do you think this momentum, I mean, because there's market aspects and there's political aspects of this, but do you think this is just inevitable or maybe not?
Well, this is definitely speculative on my part, but I think what we have going on, at least with what I'll just phrase as corn belt agriculture for now in the crop sector, what's really driving everything, I believe, is Brazil. And the corn belt farmers, I think, know that they have an extremely formidable competitor in Brazil and South America, broadly speaking. And some other areas are also now more competitive than they were 20 years ago, like the Ukraine and Russia in corn and wheat. There's enormous competitive pressures on corn belt agriculture from other export competitors with all of that centering on Brazil soybeans. And in that environment, I mean, this is kind of harsh, but I think I call it the big give up for corn belt agriculture in terms of exports being the driver of continued expansion and health in the sector. And consequently, we've turned inward and we're putting the walls up. Reversing, I would say going back to more what maybe policy looked like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I know you're a student of ag policy, Jenny. And one of the, and this is all kind of a dynamic process that rolls along and is impacted by current events. But it's very clear that Corn Belt agriculture on the crop side has latched onto biofuels as the most important determinant of, continued growing demand. And that's, I think, just where we stand today. That's very different than where we were 15 or 20 years ago when, the commodity organizations, led with everything related to agricultural trade policy for ag commodities. And now it's very clearly we lead with domestic demand and in particular biofuels on the domestic side. And it's kind of hard to argue with success. It's been a very successful strategy if it has the level of some kind of directed strategy for the crop sector here in the Corn Belt. So that's my reaction.
Right. All right. And if the demand for if this continues to grow, and I think this covers a lot of your research, are we going to see energy and agricultural commodity markets become even more linked? Are you worried about how prices are formed, volatility with that?
It clearly does link the fortunes of U.S. Corn Belt agriculture more closely to what's going on in broader fossil fuels market. There's no doubt about that, but it's not always negative in the ways you might think. For example, today with crude oil taking off to the territory of $100 a barrel, that makes biofuels in general, and especially ethanol and the role that it plays as kind of a dampener of these kind of spikes really begins to resonate and be salient. Right now, the U.S. is producing about 1.5 million barrels of biofuels a day. And I think the US uses something like 12 to 15 million barrels a day. So it's a significant contribution to the overall supply. And, when the world is flush with crude oil, that's not as important. But right now, it is a relevant point to make. How much worse would the price spike be in the US without those 1.5 million barrels? I mean, we can argue about it, and people do constantly about the magnitude of those kind of price dampening effects, but they're real. I think that it's so, in other words, high crude oil prices are not necessarily bad for biofuels and therefore bad for Corn Belt agriculture. Some parts of it are, and it does raise some production costs and on that side of the enterprise budget. But there's also some very positive impacts. So, you have to be really careful in just making broad statements about this linkage and how it hurts and how it helps. It's a little more subtle than I think people may realize. And I think we are now tied to that continuing in the long run. I don't see that changing. So this is where we are.
Right. So there's definitely upsides and downsides to that, but you're saying it's inevitable. Could we talk a little bit more about some of those trade-offs, maybe starting with consumers both in the US and low-income countries?
Well, I think this is where there's a really sharp division among different biofuels. The US corn ethanol industry actually doesn't need mandates now to have a firm place in the gasoline marketplace. Ethanol is now well acknowledged to be the cheapest source of octane in gasoline blends. And so, in other words, this is so some people have a hard time believing this, but I believe it is true. Imagine the RFS and the ethanol mandate going away tomorrow. I don't believe we would use 1 gallon less ethanol than we are today. It might harm future growth in higher blends, but I don't think we'd go backwards. So, and this kind of rule for corn ethanol in gasoline for its emissions benefits and octane, that role is growing around the world. And so I think that that's a source of really strong ethanol exports we've seen in recent years. And again, I don't see that really changing. So where countries are adding ethanol to their gasoline pools, besides the emissions benefits, I think the evidence is it holds down the cost of gasoline because of the octane properties. So there really isn't, in my opinion, a very large food versus fuel trade-off there, no matter what people try to convince you otherwise. That's not the case, though, with other kinds of biofuels, in particular what we call biomass-based diesel, which is biodiesel, renewable diesel, and most of the SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, that we're making these days. Those are much more expensive than the petroleum fossil fuels that they replace. And so it's costly to force that into the transportation fuel supply. And so it does cost consumers. As the blend rate for those kind of fuels rises, the cost will inevitably rise for consumers. Now, it may be worth the environmental and climate benefits to do that, but it does cost consumers in the pocketbook in higher prices of diesel, which is not the case, I would argue, for ethanol. So these are very different in their impacts ultimately when you get down the line for consumers.
It's a pretty nuanced picture. If we could talk a little bit about the downsides. So when, oil prices are high, ethanol is an important source of supply, and that can get transmitted to agricultural commodity prices. I guess the inverse is when oil prices are low. What are the downsides of that? Or volatile? I mean,
Well, and it's again kind of tricky in that on the ethanol side, because ethanol basically is now driven by basically the economics of fossil fuels. It's just now part of the gang. And so if refiners and crude oil refiners, gasoline manufacturers, and ethanol plants are producing a lot and the prices are high, their fortunes tend to rise and fall together now. But that's not true on the biomass-based diesel side. It has to be forced into the market, and it largely is cushioned from the volatility in the fossil fuel markets. So again, kind of a division. You have to really think differently about corn ethanol versus, say, soybean oil biodiesel and how the entire market economics work.
Now I'd like to talk about conflicts, global conflicts, geopolitical shocks. Agriculture's always been exposed to these, but now if we look at what's happening in the Middle East, do you think having an increasing role for biofuels makes U.S. agriculture even more exposed?
Well, it is on the production cost side, just purely the price of fossil fuels is a production cost for U.S. agriculture. It also is a demand dampener through higher transportation and packaging costs. The farm to retail price spread goes up with the price of crude oil. If it ultimately causes a recession, that's a big negative. But I'd argue that that's pretty much always been the case. It's not really connected to rising profile for biofuels. Largely, biofuels helps to offset those more traditional negative impacts of energy price shocks within the sector.
And I think, a lot of things you talked about is that the relationship's not as straightforward as you see. What do you think are the most misunderstood things about biofuels and agricultural markets that you've encountered?
Well, I'd say the number one is quite easily and most controversial is the role of ethanol. That bombarded with policy research coming out of parts of the ag econ profession, but particularly out of environmental economics and the climate community that says, corn ethanol is evil and it's a huge negative in terms of increases in production. And I'm not saying that there aren't some follow on environmental issues that are important, but again, easily the number one misconception is related to the blending value of ethanol due to its octane contribution. You go look at any peer-reviewed research that comes out of environmental economics and climate literature, none of it, as far as I know, or extremely few papers incorporate that value for ethanol. And so the common argument is that ethanol clearly does have only 2/3 of the energy value. In other words, a gallon of ethanol will only get you 2/3 as far as a gallon of pure E0 gasoline. That's absolutely true. And so you'll see this is a bad deal for American consumers because they're getting taken advantage of by forcing to use a much less energy efficient component in the gasoline blend with no offsetting advantages. You've got all these other kinds of environmental issues associated with increased corn production, and therefore this is easily a bad deal. I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but that's basically the position of environmental and climate change community from scientists down to advocates. And they're just wrong. That you go inside the refining industry and you find anybody that knows what they're talking about understands the entire system has adjusted to the octane value that ethanol contains. And here's my simplest way to illustrate the point. Whenever we have large spikes in the price of corn now, there will inevitably be proposals from someplace, typically coming out of the environmental climate area. The way to solve the price spike is to waive the RFS mandates for corn ethanol. Every time I have to push back against them and say, you don't understand the economics of gasoline blending in the United States, because they don't. Because you can remove the mandates all you want. We're not going to use 1 gallon less ethanol because of its octane value. And so it's kind of a long-winded explanation, but it's really important. And it's amazing how few people understand.
We talk about it in my class.
Well,
Pretty
only
basic.
for you, Jenny. I know that there's a former student from Illinois that's getting it right. But what's really interesting about that is the U.S. refining industry doesn't like to advertise that fact, not out of spite, because they're very concerned about losing further market share to ethanol in this fight over moving from an maybe a standard of 18 in the United States. But
All right.
you talk to them in private, they'll tell you it's absolute.
All right. Should we open this up for group discussion now?
Brad, Mark, what questions do you have for Scott?
I'll hop in there. I was reading an article on Brazil, and they're currently at 25% ethanol blends in their auto market, and they're going to 30 to 35% ethanol blends. As I read the news from that part of the world, what's the prospects, and why wouldn't we want to consider higher blends than 15%? We're having trouble getting to 15% in this country. Is it well, as a free market economist, does a free market work in this kind of a situation, or is it mainly a politically determined market?
Well, it's really market combination across countries. No country truly has free market policies on energy, just like we don't really have free market policies on food and agriculture. They're just two foundations of modern industrial economies that most countries say are too important to 100% leave to just truly free market economics. For example, Brazil has a national policy, and they've had it since the 1970s, to make petroleum gasoline relatively expensive compared to ethanol. And so they have a national system of flex fuel requirements on all their vehicles. And they intentionally have a national policy that makes it look sort of like a free market, but it is definitely not. They have historically had balance of payments problems because they were big importers of crude oil and didn't have large deposits. Now that's been changing over time, and so this was a boon to their domestic sugarcane industry, which is now being cannibalized by corn ethanol within Brazil, which is an interesting story in itself. So basically, Brazil has run a national policy for the last 50 years to encourage ethanol as a substitute for petroleum gasoline, and they look like they're going to continue in that direction. But it's important to recognize that's a part of an overall national policy bundle that has tried to discourage imports of crude oil into Brazil. Here in the U.S., we have a very different position. We're now the world's largest producer of crude oil, an exporter of refined products, diesel and gasoline. So we're in a very different position. We could spend an entire hour on what has been holding back a relatively modest move in the U.S. from even going from an E10 to an E15 ethanol mix. It's a whole set of factors, in my opinion. But what really makes it different is that we have a very large, very influential, very efficient, kind of dominant crude oil extraction and refining sector in the U.S., and their interests, tend to hold sway, where that's not the case for a country that was a big importer like Brazil. So that's kind of my answer to that.
Scott, I think as you've described some of the outlook in the market for biofuels, and we've described it here, the discussion has led to the point of this market is certainly dependent upon policy, or at least it's dramatically shaped by policy. It's clearly not free market or independent alone. But you also have, in this setting and elsewhere, talked about maybe some different fates for the ethanol market versus the biomass-based diesel market. What's the role of policy in contrasting the role of policy in each of those markets?
Well, I think, to put it as straightforward as I can, Brad, policy on the corn ethanol side now is all about increasing the U.S. ethanol blend rate from E10 to E15. That's the cutting edge in that sector. And on the biomass-based diesel side, it's all about continued support for that basically being sold as, supporting domestic energy production, energy security. But the big difference is, right now and going forward, that sector is 100% dependent on policy. 100%. So, with today's RVO announcement, that was the centerpiece of the latest policy support. But that sector also faces the largest policy risk if a future administration decides to reverse course.
Well, Scott, you're right. Building on that, Today is the announcement of the RVO obligations going forward. Yesterday's announcement was of the E15 waiver for the summer, but with still a push towards steam legislation or year-round E15 yet to come. But consider that whole bundle of policy issues. There's a federally mandated volume obligation. There is a federal tax incentive for reduced carbon biofuels. There are state incentives in some places as well. There are state regulated fuel markets where there is a demand for a certain percentage or a certain volume of renewables. Where should agriculture and the biofuel sector look? What's the driver going to be in the months or years ahead? Where's the policy leadership likely to come from?
That's a great question, Brad. Again, I think we have to think about it a bit differently on the ethanol and biomass-based diesel
Yep.
side. I guess my reaction to your question is corn ethanol is probably going to grow more from local, state level initiatives, kind of coming through incentives through low carbon fuel states like California, Oregon, Washington, now New Mexico, Hawaii. Getting a bigger role for corn ethanol in those states, industry led promotion programs, things like that. So I think this kind of probably more state and local on the corn ethanol side, continuing to develop expanded demand for ethanol. For biomass based diesel, it has probably a larger stack of policies that are important to it at both the local, state, and national level. But paraphrasing from the Lord of the Rings, there's one rule that rules them all, and that's the RFS. For that sector, and that is why in this first year and a half of the Trump administration, there's been such intense lobbying over the biomass-based diesel RVOs, renewable volume obligations, because this is the one mandate that sets the size of the national market for biomass-based diesel. And then the local rules basically determine where that biofuel is going to be consumed, not whether it will be consumed. That is set by the national RFS mandate. As I say, as an ag economist, Brad, I really like analyzing the BBD markets because with a little bit of arithmetic, you can compute market demand based on the annual RVOs issued by the EPA. I've never come across another market like that in my entire long career. The supply side is always a challenge, but the demand side for BBD turns out to be a fairly straightforward exercise in arithmetic once you have the RVOs, which they create the demand. So that's my perspective on all that.
Economists worry about elasticity in supply and demand. What you're describing is the demand is very inelastic because it's set.
Well, in fact, Brad, if we want to bring in, econo speak into this, the mandates mean that demand is nearly domestic demand.
Yes.
Or BBD is actually perfectly inelastic at the
Nearly
mandate.
vertical.
It's vertical. It simplifies a lot of what we have to do, Brad.
Let me ask sort of a rhetorical question, because as we look at corn ethanol, and there are there's Amber Waves of Grain in Kansas, I know, which tries to utilize some wheat in the biofuels ethanol business. But where would we be in the Corn Belt and the Midwest if we didn't have the ethanol industry there? Because half our corn goes into ethanol.
Again, a very interesting question, Mark. The way to frame that is the Corn Belt, the price of corn from the mid 70s until 2006 in the U.S. Corn Belt averaged about $2.40 a bushel. Since the ethanol boom really started in the early 2000s, so for the last 18 years, the price of corn in the Midwest has averaged about $4.50. Now, not 100% of that can be attributed to corn ethanol, and ag economists have still not settled as a profession what proportion does it deserve. Basically, the only really two big changes that could explain that is a combination of the ethanol boom and the continued dramatic growth until very recently in Chinese soybean export demand. So It's a little hard to tease that out, but I'm very confident that of that change in the price of corn, at least half of it, probably I would put around 2/3 of it is probably due to the ethanol boom. So there's your answer, someplace in that range. Without it, we would be, we would have a hard time average prices ever getting above, say, 350, three and a quarter, 350. Very different world, very different land prices, very different asset values.
And aren't we doing this level of production pretty much with the same or less crop acreage than what we had 26 years ago or
Yeah,
so?
exactly. Total amount of corn and soybean acreage in the U.S. Changed very little in the last 25 years, while we've been able to do this without even greater price pressure because of the continuous growth in productivity per acre. The doom and gloomers about the food versus fuel debate when the ethanol boom first started were fundamentally wrong, largely because they didn't really understand the robustness of technological productivity improvements in the crop sector. I mean, we have been bumping along now for nearly 70 years since the late 1950s, with corn yields growing at about 2 bushels an acre. And there's a constant debate among ag economists about what the trend yield profile looks like for corn and soybeans in the U.S. I have my opinion, but it's been common in recent years for the people coming from the climate change literature to argue that U.S. corn trend yields are plateauing. And we blew that up this summer with 187 bushel U.S. average corn yield, blew that to smithereens. So I'd like to, I guess, toot my own horn a little bit. I've been arguing that for a long time, that those predicting doom on U.S. Corn trend yields just were wrong. What I worry about, Mark, more than plateauing, I think the evidence is due to continued genetic improvement, management improvements, et cetera, that we've probably ticked up that rate going to the forward, which makes me a little concerned about surpluses. And the evidence on soybeans in the last 10 years is very unequivocal that we've seen, due to a combination of management and genetics, that soybean yields have definitely gone on a nonlinear uh, upward trend. And so that it's a critical perspective on the whole biofuels arguments is what do you believe about trend yields? Not only here in the U.S., obviously it matters in Brazil. Another big cushion on the biomass-based diesel side, Mark, is the enormous increases in soybean production in Brazil, and they've pretty much caught up with U.S. yields. So if you ask me, despite all these positive things about biofuels that I've been talking about, they're there and they're real, a nagging worry I have is not deficits in the next 10 years, but surpluses because of rising acreage in South America and ticking up of the rate of growth in trend yields for corn and soybeans. This is the one that I'm really kind of queasy about.
Scott, that reinforces over nearly 100 years of farm programs and farm bills. We've spent a whole lot more time worried about surpluses than we have deficits.
Yeah.
Out of the last, 15 years or so have been kind of anomalous from a
Yes, they have. Yeah.
historical standpoint. And maybe, I have to admit, there's a lot of really smart, good people that work in the climate area, and there are some disquieting things going on with regard to climate trends that we cannot dismiss. For example, the climate literature shows that the U.S. Midwest has been a very anomalous, what they call warming hole, the last 25 or 30 years, while the rest of the world average temperatures have risen rather remarkably, especially in the summers in the U.S. Corn Belt. That has not happened. Now, maybe that'll last a lot longer, maybe it won't. So we do have to recognize that there are larger climate risks to our corn, soybean, and wheat production in the U.S. going forward than there has been in the past. That's real. But what's fascinating is it has not actually hit yet.
So based on your analysis of corn and beans, which is very dear to Iowa farmers' hearts, as we look forward, if these surpluses develop, uh, is would I be correct to kind of suggest that we ought to focus more on ethanol expansion for sustainable aviation fuels and marine fuels more so than on the soybean diesel side of the picture? Or what's your thoughts about that?
Well, that's a fascinating area, Mark, to think about because that intersects with the truly historical technology transition that we're going through, just getting started in most of the world. We'll just call it the EV transition. Now, different people have different views on this. View is that transition is going to happen, that we will, at some point in the very long run, we are going to all be driving automated, self-driving vehicles. And my argument for that is not based on policy or any particular climate viewpoint. It's just name me an area where digital technology has not won in the long run. It always wins. It's cheapest. Electrons win in the long run. And that's my view. Now, that can sound really scary for liquid fuel demand, but I think we're in in a 40 or 50 year transition, and we're just getting started. And so it's not like this is going to happen even in the next 5 or 10 years. But in the long run, we have to expect that the vast majority of our current liquid fuel demand for transportation in the US and globally is going to go away. That's the long run future. And you wouldn't probably have said that maybe 20 years ago, even. But that is my view. It's going to take, 4 or 5 decades for that transition to occur. The technology is just advancing very rapidly. I know an area that I thought would be safer longer from the EV transition were semi trucks. And there's lots of limitations because of their power needs. So what does Elon Musk and Tesla just announced? Just sprung on the world? A electric semi that seems to actually have some chance of practical applications. And so that's a critical perspective in the very long run, Mark, for U.S. crop sector to take a position on. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, but you need to have a position on that. In this early stage of the EV transition, I see a lot of people kind of relaxing, a sigh of relief that we've taken away the subsidies, the tax credits for EVs, and you hear all the negative news about falling EV sales. All that is true, but we're not keeping our eye on the ball here in the short to intermediate term. I'll call that the next 5 or 10 years, and that's hybrids. Hybrids are clearly the sweet spot for the EV transition for at least the next 5 or 10 years. And all that is it just simply takes 2 hybrids to equal the demand loss from one battery electric vehicle. And that is proceeding very rapidly. So basically, the next 5 to 10, 15 years, what you're looking at is the corn ethanol industry and crude oil refiners fighting over market share in a declining market. I just don't see any way that that's not the general landscape moving forward. And I'm basing that on hybrid adoption, they are selling like hotcakes compared to battery electric vehicles like Tesla these days. So that's what the future we face. And Mark, as you indicated, how much of Corn Belt agricultural profitability rests on biofuels demand. This is a big long-term issue for this sector. And that means that if you're going to continue to rely on biofuels for that driver of domestic demand, it's going to, in the long run, have to happen outside of light-duty vehicles, cars and trucks. And that is where sustainable aviation fuel is the main market in the long run, I believe. And because there isn't anything on the horizon that suggests that liquid jet fuel is going to be replaced at any time in coming decades. Basically, the way I like to put it, being a Star Trek fan, until we get dilithium crystal engines in our jetliners or in our airplanes, we're going to be filling them with jet fuel. That's a 25, probably going to a 30 billion gallon a year market going forward. There's just no other way to decarbonize it or to reduce its carbon footprint except biofuels. And if, as a society, we think that's important, sustainable aviation fuel is the only game in town and is likely to be. And which means, I think, really, I over and over have urged our agricultural leadership to kind of begin building the groundwork, the foundation for that kind of transition. And I know they're working hard at it. And that's just kind of the only lifeline that I see out there. There's a lot of discussion about maritime fuels, and that may be another market in the long run, because that's a huge market globally as well. But I'm not sure the economics work as well there. There's actually been less work, so I'm not terribly well informed on that. But I know for sure that airliners are going to need liquid jet fuel for many, many, many decades. And I think that that's where we ought to be pushing on policy for biofuels in the long
Scott, you briefly mentioned sugarcane before,
run.
and I feel like I used to hear about sugarcane being very efficient a while ago, and I haven't heard about it recently. So I'm wondering, do you see most of you talked about global demand for ethanol. Is that going to mostly come from corn?
Oh, absolutely. What's going on,
Yeah.
Jenny, in Brazil tells you all you need to know.
Yeah.
It's actually a vicious political battle within Brazil, which is basically in the center west state of Mato Grosso and so on. That's where the center of the safrinha second corn crop growth has occurred in the last couple of decades. That's where they're building just copies of U.S. ethanol plants. It's the same company is building them. And the traditional sugarcane plants can't compete because their feedstock is so much cheaper. It's always, you can just produce so much more starch per hectare or per acre here in the US with corn production at a much lower cost. You produce more of it at a much lower cost than you can with sugarcane. Sugarcane is very expensive to produce, relatively labor intensive. And so, I don't think sugarcane ethanol is going to play much of a role going forward in terms of its market cost. Now, this is where we get into environmental and climate kinds of arguments. What you were reflecting, Jenny, was in terms of the life cycle carbon
Yeah.
profile of sugar cane ethanol in Brazil, it was supposed to be better than U.S. corn ethanol because they would power their plants with renewable electricity through burning of what's called bagasse. But as we can see, other than that, I mean, it really doesn't stand a chance in a market when there's a level playing field for the price of corn ethanol versus sugarcane ethanol.
And there's no other alternatives? No other, I mean, I don't know much about sugarcane, but globally, there's not many other alternatives at scale to corn.
No, not on the ethanol side. There's a lot of R&D and a lot of discussion always about second generation, ethanol made from corn stover was hot for a while. There's different kinds of woody mass that are available in large scale, some of these alternative feedstocks, but they're vastly more expensive to transport to a plant and vastly more expensive to break down into the starch components that are needed to ultimately make ethanol. That's why it's never happened, because it's dramatically more expensive to produce than corn ethanol. So as long as you're comparing market economics, corn ethanol always wins.
Does wheat ethanol fall into that bucket too, Scott? It was brought up by Mark a bit ago. And what's the future of wheat-based biofuels?
I don't know a lot about that, Eric, but what I do know is it's just not competitive with corn because you just don't simply produce enough starch content per acre. So in that sense, it probably shares the uncompetitiveness of things like woody biomass and corn stover. I mean, even something like grain sorghum, which is a lot more like corn, is not really competitive. We're ruled by corn right now.
Corn is king.
Corn is king, which
Wheat
is
in
what I grew
Kansas.
up with in Iowa. So we had a local American Legion group that was famous in one of my little hometowns where I grew up, and they drove around in a Model A with a stand on top of it and played in parades and so on. And they were called the Corn Kings for a reason.
Scott, I have one more question if I could beg of you, and I know Jenny will hold us to time here, or Eric might, but we're talking about agriculture and ag producers really being focused on what are the drivers of future bioenergy growth and demand. And yet the policy questions are happening at EPA is setting the RVOs. Department of Energy is running the model that determines the carbon intensity of corn going into a biofuel chain. And it's the Department of Treasury who's writing the rules on the tax credit. Department of Ag doesn't actually have a seat at that table, except to say a broader influence. How does ag respond to sort of this broader federal role and dispersion of rulemaking that impacts an ag market like this?
Again, excellent point, Brett, from policy. Based on our conversation, and these are my views, obviously, others might have different takes. If you buy my argument that biofuels and biofuel demand is as important to the Corn Belt crop sector as I think it is, then you have to broaden your vision for the agencies for which you need to influence policy outside of the USDA and Farm Bill titles. Those are still important. So I don't want to discourage any of the kind of work that's done in those areas, but it's just a reality that ag now has a large stake in all of the debates and policy development from all the agencies that you just mentioned, Brad. And I know that the trade organizations are working hard, so I don't want to diminish their efforts. They try to keep up as best they can, but I do think that we have, in particular, some real deficiencies in influence from the agriculture perspective in things like the development of the GREET model. There's an entire kind of industry of academics and NGO types who are attending the hearings, submitting research, and influencing those policy debates. And I think we in ag have been lagging in having a voice in some of those kind of behind the scenes policy development, which we're so used to, and I would say so good at from traditional farm programs. And, it needs to be a development there because small changes in the GREET model assumptions can have some significant economic impacts. And I know that the ag organizations, they know this. I've talked to them. But in some areas, I think they've had a harder time cracking that than in others. And one in particular is in this whole life cycle carbon area. And a lot more work needs to be paid attention to there because now I will refrain from really going on a rant on this, Jenny, at the end, because I know we're getting over time.
We need a little controversy. It's good.
Well,
Bring it on.
nothing upsets me more than indirect land use charge calculations.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes. Do tell.
Well, the way I like to put it is this is interesting academic research that has never been ready for prime time as the foundation for really policy that has important economic impacts. And I've always been skeptical the entire literature on indirect land use charges because you're going to tell me how current changes in crop prices, particularly corn, are going to influence land use changes and your carbon calculations for the next 50 years. We can't even predict the price of corn the next 6 months. So directionally, there's nothing wrong with the arguments. So the argument is that policy raises the price of corn. This leads us to plant more corn. It leads other countries to plant more corn. And we tear down in its most extreme form. We cut down the Amazon rainforest, which is really bad from a climate change perspective. And so the chain of logic is, I think, absolutely correct in terms of higher corn prices cause us to use more corn acreage in the short run. But where and exactly when, incredibly difficult to predict. And so I just have no confidence whatsoever in any of the computations of indirect land use
They
charges.
make a big difference in these life cycle analysis models, is my
And
understanding.
in fact, my kind of arguments have started to gain some traction. Tax credits were changed in the Big Beautiful Bill last summer to delete indirect land use charges from computations. My favorite way to pillory the indirect land use charge calculations. Take something like used cooking oil imported from China. It gets what is used cooking oil? It's vegetable oil. It never gets an indirect land use charge because it's a waste product. And it never considers we ship the stinking stuff halfway around the world. What's that do to its carbon footprint? And there's just lunatic stuff like that in this modeling. Literally, I think it is flimflammery if you really dig into it, and it does not hold up in terms of, it's presented as point estimates that are irrefutable. That's just nonsense, utter nonsense. So is that enough of a rant for you, Jenny?
That was fun. I did tell, I think it was a year and a half ago, I joked that our commodity groups need to become experts on life cycle analysis. So it's good
And
to
I think,
say all that.
and that's only the worst part of life cycle analysis. Basically, what happened is the environmental groups got on board with the renewable fuel standards in the mid 2000s, and they thought it was going to lead to, ethanol made from wood chips or miscanthus or something like that. And when they saw that that was not going to happen, and that what was really happening was the dominance of corn ethanol, they invented out of whole cloth this idea of indirect land use charges to penalize corn ethanol. Because if there's one thing the environmental community in the U.S. hates, is modern industrial corn production. And I use that word. They have a vitriolic, they just despise corn production, and they really believe we have to get rid of it completely. That is their underlying policy benchmark. And I will have to say, they do raise legitimate environmental problems with modern large-scale corn production, mainly due to excessive application of nitrogen and nitrogen runoff in the water supply. That's a real issue. We in agriculture can't ignore it. But the solution is not to basically try to lobby for the elimination of the U.S. corn sector. That's lunacy. So the whole LCA life cycle carbon analysis outside of this indirect land use charge nonsense, it's over multiple decades. What confidence can you have in those numbers? You see a CI score for, a corn ethanol plant in Iowa or a renewable diesel plant in Illinois using soybean oil, and it's this really specific number, 31.83, whatever it is. That's insane. So that we know any of this to that degree of precision. So that's my whole point.
Someone who wrote an article back in about 2010, 2011 on the indirect land use charge, calling it flimflammery, is probably a pretty good term. I'm glad to hear
Good.
you,
I'm glad
to hear that you said the things that you concluded, because I've been saying that for the last 20 years almost. Well, it didn't come up until 2010, for the last 16 years.
Not surprising that you got there first, Mark.
Well, but they didn't listen to me, so.
Well, they're not listening to me either, so we can.
I'm reminded of this, Scott, as you talk about indirect land use and this calculation, and it's like you can calculate the emissions down to the fourth decimal point until you get to land use, and then you just sort of have a number that you assume is correct and add it to it. And that meant for a time, at least under California's renewable mandates, that Brazilian ethanol was more environmentally friendly than Midwestern ethanol.
Yes.
Which meant that there were literally, as I've described in class, there were literally 2 ships passing in the night. One of them was loaded with ethanol coming from Brazil going to California. One of them was loaded with ethanol from the Midwest going to Brazil to replace the market that was displaced by moving it to California. So if there was an indirect land use, there was at least an indirect maritime fuel emissions impact there as well, right?
You're absolutely right. And ultimately, my favorite economics phrase, there ain't no free lunches. And just that simple question, what's the price of gasoline in California?
Yeah, we
all
know.
know, it's $1.50, $2 higher than the rest of the US. Somebody pays for that.
Well, this has been excellent dialogue and insight, and we could go on for a while, I would imagine, but we'll just call it good right there. Scott, we definitely appreciate you making these contributions to our podcast. This was going to be helpful for understanding for a lot of folks out there who have a distinct interest in biofuels and where they fit into our agricultural economy. So thank you very much for sharing your time and your introspect.
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate the really perceptive questions. And particularly, Jenny, thank you for allowing me to pontificate and on occasion rant a little bit about my frustrations in the area. Thank you very, very much.
And thanks to our panel as well, Jenny and Brad and Mark. Again, with us has been Scott Irwin. He is from the University of Illinois. Our panelists regularly, as always, Jenny Ifft of Kansas State University, Brad Lubben, University of Nebraska, and Mark Edelman, Iowa State University. Remember, the Clearing the Air podcast is posted on the website flinchbaughcenter.com. And there's lots of other terrific information there that you'll want to check out, RE Ag Policy, at that website, flinchbaughcenter.com. We'll return next month with another podcast. Until from Kansas State University, Eric Atkinson, good day.